Welcome back, everybody. Let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for your continued watch care and your goodness over us. The more we understand about our own humanity, the more we will understand about your divinity. As these two natures combine with each other, help us to realize and understand intellectually and experientially that the combination of humanity and divinity is the true path to freedom. In Jesus' name, Amen. I want to welcome everybody back. So we had quite a bit of discussion in our first presentation. Just want to go over some of the questions that we spoke of in the first presentation. And what I'll do this time is I'll just give you my answers, my thoughts. Sometimes when we go through this in a group setting, people say that they're left confused because they don't understand the conclusion. What they really mean is that they are not clear what my position is. So I'm not saying that people need to or it's a good idea, but because there's a request or demand for it, I'll comply. I'll comply. So I'm going to read the question in its entirety, almost. For the translators, I'll post it on the forum. So I'll read it all, and it will give the translators time to catch up. If the governing power of the will is the fast brain or lower powers, with power of the Holy Spirit and Christ in us, can't we stay in slow brain and let the higher power take over so we don't need to react or defend self? in doing so, aren't we given a choice to turn the other cheek? What's the what's the point of nature of man, the human study that has been done, if you can't choose which one? Because we are made to react or defend doesn't make sense to me. In my mind, it is to get to the point with Christ that there is no self to defend. If we could turn to a Bible passage, or you can just listen. This is Matthew 5:38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus is going to give a response to that. And we'll read another Bible passage. Matthew 5:39, it's actually the next verse. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. So we mentioned 539 because it's part of the question, and I went back to 538 to give a broader context to this subject. We should all be aware of three groups of people: the writer, we'll call it the commentator, and the audience. And the audience obviously comes in two parts. So technically, there's four. The audience for the writer, and then the audience for the commentator. And when you're looking at any document that's been written, you have to be aware, if we'll call it the four groups, you have to be aware of the four groups. If you are not aware of them, you'll end up making mistakes in your understanding or analysis of what you read. This is why there's a tension between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As you know, 538 is an Old Testament passage or concept. And if you can see it, it's now going to be used as a launching pad or a platform to make a separate point. This initially seems a straightforward passage, but as you review it, as you analyze it, there are multiple levels of complexity to this. If you can't see it, or if you're inexperienced, you are very likely to make a mistake and come to a wrong conclusion. So first of all, there was an original writer, and now there's someone who's taking that writing and bringing it into the modern era. The modern era is 2,000 years ago. And now we're reading it 2,000 years later. And each one of those authors or commentators has an audience. And most of the time, that audience doesn't understand what they're being told. They don't understand the message that's being given. And we are as guilty of that as our foreparents. So there's that point. Then, this is obviously Jesus. Jesus is going to juxtapose two concepts. It's going to contrast two behaviors. One that sounds vengeful, and the contrast of that is one that sounds conciliatory or forgiving. And as we review a passage like this, which seems seductively simple, I want to suggest it's full of snares and traps for you if you're not careful. Because what we tend to do is take statements that are thousands of years old, bring them into our own immediate context, often on a personal level, not a political one, or a societal one. And in doing all of that, we lose sight of what something like this is trying to teach us. And when you take all of that, what I've just said, it's easy for someone like the questioner to say, instructed to turn the other cheek, not resist. And if you're going to follow that mandate, if you don't even call it counsel, there's no need for self-defense because there is no self. It's easy to come to wrong conclusion or make mistakes. I hope to come to this passage again in the future. So I'm not going to defend what I'm saying now. I'm going to state it as fact. This idea of turning the other cheek. The question you need to ask yourself is, what does it mean? And what I want to suggest is the following. I'm not going to prove it. I'm not asking for your comments. We are now in the cusp or on the cusp of a change of dispensation from the old to the new when this statement is written. So this is 539. This is the old and the new. We could define the old and the new differently. So I'm going to suggest it's this way. We'll call it God's kingdom. And on this side I'd put what? Just one word. Someone shout out. Louder, because I can't hear otherwise. If God's on one side, who's on the other? If you don't shout out, I can't hear. Satan. So we're going to go from God's kingdom to Satan's kingdom. We're going to go from a theocracy to, we would call it secularism. We're going to go from the Jewish economy to what economy? To the Roman economy. So we'll put the Jews to Rome. Put Jewish. That, what I've put here, isn't new to any of us. But it has significant ramifications in how we understand New Testament theology. I want to suggest, and I'm aware that we can look at passages in different ways, in different layers. (538) eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, is not a moral statement. What kind of statement is it? Or instruction or guidance? It's a judicial statement. It's law, if you like. Penal code, if you're familiar with that term. This is not a moral statement about how we should deal with our neighbor. So this passage 538 is not revenge. If 538 is not revenge, and 539 is not a contrast of 538, it's a bad idea to use too many negatives. What does that mean that 539 is not? 539 is not, I'm going to call it, a moral statement between you and your neighbor. If we go back to this model, this framework of a change of dispensation, you're required to turn the cheek. Does anybody want to venture what that means? Whom are you turning the cheek to? The other cheek. Someone has harmed you. Now you're going to turn the other cheek to get more harm. Saying this is not between neighbors. Shout out, I'll repeat it. So Curtis has said the system. So I'm going to say you turn the cheek to Rome. This is a political statement. It's not an interpersonal directive of how two people deal with one another. Neighbors, spouses, parents and children, friends. This is how the citizenry interacts with the state. With a state that doesn't have your interests at heart. That has not been designed from the ground up to have the same ideology that you do. So now you're living under a pagan system, a secular system, pagan Rome, and when pagan Rome acts in a way that you feel is wrong, they slapped you. What you're not allowed to do? Resist. You cannot protest and resist. You have to turn the other cheek and take more punishment. So the question you need to ask yourself is why? Not why do you turn the cheek? Why does God allow a corrupt system, Satan's system, Satan's governance, to be your ruler? Why is it better to be ruled by Satan than it is by God? So I'm not going to develop this thought because it's not part of the question. But what I want to say is when we start taking Bible passages and start moralizing them, because Ellen White did, we can end up coming to wrong conclusions. You will come to wrong conclusions. Because you take things out of a context that can actually help into a context that makes more problems for you. What we have done is turn this passage, 5:39, Matthew 5:39, into the golden rule. And I want to suggest they're two independent principles. If you want to do a turn the other cheek ideology, you go to the golden rule to do that. Not this passage. This passage, I'm suggesting, is instructing you how to deal under the new dispensation when you live in Satan's kingdom, which God is putting you in. So, having said all of that, going back to the question, when people start asking or talking in the framework of turning cheeks, I think they're misusing, if not misapplying, these verses. The fast brain does not govern the will. Point one. You can have as much Christ in you, and it won't make any difference. The fast brain cannot take over the slow brain and vice versa. The idea of self-defense occurs on so many levels. I'd only have to give you a couple to show that being in Christ does not give the slow brain supernatural power over the fast brain. I've addressed the issue of turning the other cheek. The question is, what's the point of all these studies if you can't choose which brain to have? What I have tried to say is not that you don't have those emotions, those feelings, those reactions. The fast brain ones. I'm saying you have to be aware of your nature because it helps you better deal with the consequences of your nature. This is not sinless or sinful nature. What's the difference between sinful and sinless nature? About 0.1%. For all intents and purposes, there's no difference between the two. You can sin equally well in both natures, and you can be a holy person equally well in both natures. That's an old study, so that should not be anything new to us. So, what I want us to understand can you mitigate or can you compensate for the activities of fast brain? Yes, you can. Both in yourself and in your relationships with people. So, when your child fights back, what should you not do? Them. Either with your mouth or your hand, which is our natural reaction to beat them into submission. In fact, you've got Bible verses that almost say that. But if you recognize that it's their fast brain coming into action, you know how better to deal with that. When your spouse shouts at you, your employer mistreats you, it's not just about how you react to your own fast brain, it's how you react to other people's. Last point. In this person's mind, we should get to the point, we should grow up and mature, that with Christ, that you become selfless and you don't need to defend yourself. I just think that's an incorrect model of human nature. It's not the plan of salvation that I recognize. So I want to go to another question we started addressing. So the question was very surprised by the way that I looked at events in Gaza and the Ukraine. So in this morning's study, I think we came to the agreement that I never said that the King of the South is our friend. Someone said what gave a better explanation of what I said, and I can't remember what the phrase they used. Maybe they can say. Something about our interests.
The King of the South is the one who defended our interests, and this morning you mentioned our rights.
So, I think that's pretty similar to what I said last week. This morning I mentioned various groups in relation to this question. King of the North, King of the South, the Wild Horse, and Rome. And then you. So when I looked at these four groups, each one of them is working for their own interests. Each one has their own moral compass, their own ideas of right and wrong, and the direction that they want to take their own people, and I guess the world. Because all of these four powers want to rule the world. I think it was last week or the week before. We spoke about 1989 and 1991. And we said this was the wound, and this was the death. And that's why in 91, it said a new world order. And who is it that said that? The King of the North. And what were they saying? Rome has no relevancy any longer. Rome did all of its work pre-1989. Depending on how you want to do your maths, for the decade 9 to 89. The horse has been killed, has it not? From the King of the North's perspective, in this history, we all agree with that. We already know the King of the South is dead. So that's why the King of the North says we have a new world order. Because in the old world order, how many powers were there? We've got at least 4. And now, in the new world order, there's only 1. So regardless of people's political views, these 4 powers views or your own, what kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a world I'm just borrowing this phrase. It's not a political entity. Do you want to live in a world where the nations are united? Or do you want to live in a world that's controlled by one power? A multilateral entity or a unilateral entity? Which one affords you safety? Not in the short run, but in the medium to long term. I think we all know the answer to that. It's the nations when they're united together, not when it's controlled by one power. So when we talk about the King of the South defending your interests, they're not defending your moral or political viewpoint, your worldview. You hold completely different worldviews than the King of the South. But what you should recognize is that in this world, the safety lies in the United Nations, not in a unilateral political environment. And that's the point that I wanted us to see. It's not that they're defending your worldview, your right to live, because they would destroy you as readily as they would destroy the King of the South. And they have some very strange ideas that you definitely don't agree with. They have their own dangers. But when we look at the great controversy, and as we view or see how Satan controls and manipulates human beings, how Satan desires to manipulate humanity to get their will done, and we all know that story better than anybody else does. You know that whether they realize it or not, the king of the south and the horse are defending your interests, even though perhaps morally, politically, ideologically, you're aligned with the king of the north. Maybe you have some sympathy with Rome, but definitely with the king of the north, at least economically. And then religiously, you may be quite affiliated with Rome and certain of its beliefs. So that's the point I wanted to make. When we start looking at Ukraine as an example, and how we would analyze or make judgments about what's going on. And if you were to go to the Middle East, you can make the same analysis using the same rules. So going back to the question, the message from the Midnight Cry, among other things, reveals the true character of God, the true King of the North. Egalitarianism, being empathetic and full of compassion for humanity and all its creatures. The questioner proposes a statement of fact. The Midnight Cry does the following. Reveals the true King of the North, equality, empathy, compassion, those things. Who agrees that that's what the Midnight Cry taught us? Put your hands up if you agree that's what the Midnight Cry taught you. I don't want to let any secrets out. At least the questioner should put their hand up. But so we've got a few people. Who disagrees? So a couple of people disagree. Everybody that agreed was French. Everybody that disagreed was not French. Okay, so I'll give you my opinion. I don't think the Midnight Cry taught us any of that. I'm not special and I'm not holy, but I knew all of those things long before the Midnight Cry. And in fact, except for this one, because I didn't know what that meant, I knew those three when I was a boy, a very young boy. So I've known about this long time ago. Christianity never needed to teach me this. Go to Romans 1 and 2 and you have the proof text for that. They have the law written in their heart. And you don't need the Midnight Cry to teach you this. The true King of the North is a prophetic stroke doctrinal issue. These three here, these are all the Golden Rule. And the Golden Rule is a 2,000-year-old message. Let me develop this thought a bit more. I'm going to call them EEC. I know it only works in English, I apologize. EEC is 2,000 years old. Okay? And this was called the midnight cry. I'm not targeting the question because I think many people believe this. In fact, many put your hand up, so you agree with this. So, together we said equality, empathy, and compassion is a new message. So, I'm suggesting that it's a 2,000-year-old message. So, I want to move forward 1,800 years. So now it's 200 years ago, plus or minus. And I hope I don't confuse people. This is the story of the midnight cry. The concept or the logic. So I'm saying ECC is 2,000 years old. So 200 years ago, what would the midnight cry be? The cry is a statement that's spoken loudly, referring to what subject? What is the loud cry about? I'll help you. The great test. That's what the midnight cry is. It's crying out that the great test is here, if you like. 200 years ago, what was it? Sunday law. With Sunday law. So, Sunday law, this is the framework that we have. And then I'm going to put today. The suggestion is that it's ECC. We all okay with that? So, the way this is framed, the message of the midnight cry reveals this God that apparently we never knew about, and now we learn about these issues. And I would argue, if Tamina wanted to put slavery here, we could substitute slavery for what? EEC. So this theme of EEC runs all the way through. It's not new. So that can't really be what the midnight cry is. It wasn't some education that we had of the new God. Or the hidden God that we didn't see before. The horrible God. And suddenly we realize through this message that God is nice. Or the horrible right me suddenly becomes the good left me. I don't know if we've been taught incorrectly or we've misunderstood things. I take responsibility for perhaps not teaching things correctly. But what I want to say is the following. I don't believe that the midnight cry taught me EEC. All that has happened when we go to 2018, if that's how we're going to reference or mark the midnight cry, I learned one thing because I knew everything else. The great test changed from Sunday law, which is Saturday, Sunday. We'll call it the subject of equality. It's not because I didn't know about equality before, or I don't understand about the Sabbath Sunday law controversy afterwards. All that changed is what the test would be. It has ramifications, I understand that, but not as many as you think. But what it isn't a revelation of a new God with new ideas, with a new way to live, or a new way to view people. Because when you look at your own prejudices or you're in the past, I think it was in the discussion that we had earlier, many of us have made mistakes. And mistakes are not changes. So we haven't had to change our position from the right to the left, or from being racist to non-racist, or non-sexist, or sexist to non-sexist. I think we've made the mistakes in our understanding of information. If you see things differently, I'm open to discussion or disagreement, but no one has shown me how I'm not saying they need to tell me specifically, but I can't conceptualize how I changed from being a really bad person on the right to a good person on the left. I might not have focused on EEC because I didn't think it was the great test, but I was aware of it, and everyone here was aware of it, because the golden rule has been around for a long time. So, moving on to question. So even though I have to look at the world and what's happening in it through prophetic glasses, we all agree with that. I'd like to think that this message helps me to show empathy, compassion, and kindness to those who are suffering. Isn't that morality? I would conjecture or argue that empathy, compassion, and kindness wasn't taught to us in 2018. We knew it before we even joined this movement. We all understood the concepts and the behavior of what empathy, compassion, and kindness were and what they looked like. I'm not saying that you haven't become more serious, that things haven't been made clear to you, that your innate feelings, which are good, because Humans innately have a good, I call it a heart, not literally. And that has to get educated out of you, mostly by your parents. I'm not saying there's not an education process that wants to bring us back to normality or sinlessness. I'm not also arguing the following, that turning our focus to human beings than a specific day has not helped awaken your conscience. I'm not arguing any of that, but I don't think the midnight cry helps me, you, or the questioner to exhibit more empathy, more compassion, or more kindness. We could have been doing that. We should have been doing that. And I believe many of you, including the questioner, was doing that long before the midnight cry ever came. The Sunday law is right in front of us. And perhaps given our privileged status in the West, I think that's what it means, we might not be directly impacted with what's going on in those two areas that have been spoken about. But we know we have to take a stand. Question? One second, I'll finish this. I'll comment and then I'll take your question. But we know that we will have to take a stand. And that is what we are preparing ourselves for today, through the formation of a Christ-like character. I agree with that statement. Sunday law's coming. We're not going to be affected by in the same way other people are. We have to take a stand, even if that's a conceptual one. And I agree with all of that. And that's what we're preparing ourselves to do. And just the last point, morality does not prevent prophecy, and prophecy must not prevent morality. So, it's not that I don't understand that statement, I understand it. I think I just don't agree with it. So, I'll take a question, and then I'll comment a little bit more. You can use both of them.
Vas-y.
I understand what you are saying regarding EEC. It is not a new message. But the question I have asking myself is, what is the goal or the target of the Midnight Cry? Because it seems to me that the Midnight Cry highlight the issue of EEC. And
Just hold you there.
ouais.
you've said that the midnight cry, I'm going to call it the new midnight cry, the one that we have been given, the 2018 version. You said that this one, I think you said highlights EEC. Is that how you phrase it? Can you please tell me what the old midnight cry was meant to do?
I'm asking you the question.
I'll answer this one. I'll answer the one that you've given me, but I want to get an idea what you think the old one was trying to teach you. First, tell me what the old one was.
C'était quoi l'ancien? Slavery, you mean?
No,
Which one? The older one.
10 years ago. It's not a year, it's pre-2018.
But which midnight cry?
There was not a midnight cry pre-2018.
Ouais.
In 2018, this movement believed the midnight cry was something. I've called it the old one.
Oh yes, Sabbath.
What was it?
Sabbath versus
Sunday law.
Sunday law, yeah.
That was the test. Tell me what it was trying to point you to or teach you. Right there. This one here.
Which one? I can't see.
Yeah. This one here.
Wait.
This ECC means what it's pointing us to. That's what you said. The midnight cry points us to good behavior. Yes, that's what you said.
Good. Let me add to your thought. Good behavior, but also rectify our the way we see God and His government.
Don't translate that. So all it's teaching us is good behavior.
Okay. Okay.
I don't mind you disagreeing with me, but before I said it doesn't teach you anything new about God.
Yeah.
You can
But
disagree.
we forgot. We didn't
Can't
know
debate.
this. We didn't know. Yeah. Okay. We
Can't
didn't know. We didn't. We have a wrong view, and we have a
Shemaine
wrong
had a
view.
wrong view of God before 18 and I didn't. We can't use our own personal view on this. I want to move on.
Okay.
This bottom statement is about the test. So these two things are not the same at the moment. The top one and the bottom, they're different. They're teaching different things. They're saying different things. My question to you, I know what the test is, Sunday law. This doesn't tell me what the test is. This tells me what I need to behave like or what the direction to go in. Go to this one here. Tell me what the old test was trying to teach you. No, the old midnight cry, sorry. What was the old midnight cry trying to teach you?
Just like that, I will say faithfulness about the true Sabbath.
So, what you've said is, this old model, all it can do, all that you're required to do, is to get an accurate watch and know when sunset and sunset to sunset is.
et savoir quand sont les différents couchers de soleil,
Work out the finer points of cooking
comprendre un petit peu les coins de la cuisine,
and worship
de l'adoration,
and your parts.
et c'est bon.
Nothing else.
I don't view it like that, but
Alors je ne vois pas moi comme ça, mais
If we view the lesson to be gained from this old model
si on regarde la leçon qui doit être tirée de cet ancien modèle,
connected to the law, the Sunday law,
connectée à la loi du dimanche,
which means connected to the Sabbath law, the test, Sunday law, what you're learning from that, which you just said really clearly, was the day. I'm going to learn about the day.
the midst of the controversy. So that's why my answer was to remain faithful.
il faut mettre le jour au milieu de la controverse,
Ouais.
c'est pour ça que j'ai dit qu'il faut être fidèle.
Remain faithful to what?
To regarding God's day.
Par rapport au jour de
So God's
Let me I
God's,
have to stop
God's
you.
day.
That's exactly what I just said here.
The way you frame it, it's.
I know people don't like the way I frame things. I understand that. But what you've done is identified the test. Good. And then you've said the issue is what you're meant to be doing is understanding how to keep the day faithfully. If I go to the first one, that's what you're supposed to learn, EEC. What's the test?
Say equality.
Same thing. That's what you just said. So the test is the same, and what you're supposed to learn is, we'll call it treating people, we'll call it the golden rule. Great test is EEC, and you need to learn that or pass. You need to pass it by doing the golden rule. So you have in your mind you have a model where there's a fundamental difference between the new and the old. And if you, all of you, if you listen to presentations by many of our teachers, what this model that Shemaine has given to us is not her private interpretation. It's a common movement understanding. And the question was obviously asked, and I'm trying to respond to it. And what I want to say is, I disagree. I disagree with this model based upon a number of things. And what I want to say, when I say I disagree, all of this, I'm going to put me, I agree with this model. The great test is equality, and I'm supposed to learn about the golden rule. This second model, when it deals with the old midnight cry, the great test, I agree, is a Sunday law. So I'll put me. And I don't agree that what we're supposed to learn is about the day in what any context you want to say it. I think what you're supposed to learn, not yet, what you're supposed to learn is the same thing. People,
To tell you that it's the same thing.
Je voulais te dire la même chose aussi.
okay, if it's the same thing, then what Shemaine said here, she now disagrees with, because, which is fine. But what I want to say is, in the old model that we had, the new midnight cry teaches us nothing new that you didn't already know. What it did teach you is that there has been a logistical, systematic change in what the test is. What we haven't done in this study is say why. Why has there been a change? I began to explore that, I think, in April when I was in Australia. And I probably give the wrong reference. I think it's the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. I'm going to say it's 1911. I can't remember the month. That's obviously not an inspired reference. But I began to explore that, and I know I haven't completed it. But several people, when I spoke about that, immediately latched on to the point I was making. So I'm not going to say why there's been a change between the day and equality as the great test. But the end result, what it's supposed to produce, is exactly the same. You go to slavery, Sunday law, or what we call gender equality, it always produces the same thing. EEC. And if we think that there's some radical change that's happened from 2018 onward, I'll just say that I don't agree with that. I don't want to pin people down and make them appear bad or in any way. But I use people's comments as examples. A moment ago, Shemaine said, it taught us this new version of God. And the question you have to ask yourself, is that a movement position or your individual position? Maybe it radically changed the way that you saw God. Maybe you had a really bad image of God before and it helped you to come to terms with things. But I think the old God is the same as the new. This God wasn't any different. There are people that struggled with their views of that old God and therefore have come into a place where they think there's been some revolutionary or fundamental change in our message. I just don't see it that way. We can agree to disagree, that's fine. But the reason why I've spoken forthrightly on this issue is because I wanted to do justice to the question. About how we view things now and how we used to view them. So, Tamina had her hand up. Okay, I had it totally wrong.
Donc c'est August 2nd, 1892, page 48369, paragraphe 69.
Donc c'est
I knew that. I'm not going to give the page because if you're going to go back to it now, I prefer you go back to the beginning of the section. Tell me the page. Yeah, but 483 is what I quoted from. And I think if you go back to the beginning, because someone pointed this out in Wales last week, there are much more fundamental and important issues that need to be that Jones is dealing with at the beginning. The whole article is replete, which means full of really valuable truth, in my opinion. So I just want to answer a couple more questions, or partly. Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 to 8. Is it correct to think that this passage is written in the context of the great controversy? Simple answer is yes. As long as time remains, the tension between good and evil will remain. As long as time remains, the tension between good and evil will remain. I agree with that. But I think the tension actually goes beyond time into eternity. I don't see most of us agreeing on several things when we get to heaven. I mean, we might not want to call it good and evil, but they're just strong words of other emotions. Depending on where one is in the delineation of things, that simply means where you are on a line, which dispensation you're in. There is a response associated with it. I'd say yes. In the scattering, God's people are required to hate the thing that has caused the scattering. The transgression of God's people, or the attack upon God's people. So the questioner said, God's people are required to hate. Over lunch, or during the break, several people were talking about this subject, and I think some of the comments that were made were enlightening to some people, or at least changed their views. Does anybody here want to comment on this idea that we are required to hate? Because it was a concept or a question that I asked in the previous presentation. Anybody? They don't have to have sat around our table. Maybe other people spoke. Will you go, Natasha, or not? Natasha? Yeah, Natasha's going to volunteer. Thank you. As they're working out the logistics, the question that I'm asking Natasha, is based upon the question that I received.
est basée sur la question que j'ai reçue.
We're highlighting one issue
Nous soulignons une question,
that we are required to do things.
disons qu'il est exigé et attendu de nous que nous faisions des choses.
Hate.
C'est-à-dire haïr, par exemple.
And so Natasha's going to give her perspective on this idea.
Et donc Natacha va donner sa perspective sur ce sujet.
Dans la discussion qu'on a eue,
So, in the discussion we have together,
le but était de comprendre est-ce qu'on avait reçu des directives pour aimer.
so the question was, are we receive instruction to love?
Et la réponse était non, Dieu ne nous a pas demandé d'aimer.
And the answer is no, because God didn't ask us to love.
Et de même qu'il ne nous a pas demandé d'aimer, mais parce que c'est naturel d'aimer,
And as He didn't ask us to love because it's natural to love,
nous n'avons pas reçu non plus de directives pour haïr.
so we didn't receive any instruction to hate someone.
Et donc c'était devenu plus clair, en tout cas pour moi,
So for me, it's become more clearer
de comprendre la question qui était posée, est-ce qu'il y a eu des directives pour haïr?
it's become more clearer for me to understand the question you asked, if there are any instruction for us to hate.
Thank you. Before Curtis gives an answer, I want to speak about, it's the same subject but in a related way.
Je voudrais parler d'un autre sujet, mais de manière liée.
After the sin that was committed in Eden,
Après le péché qui a été commis en Éden,
what happens?
qu'est-ce qui s'est passé?
It says it in a roundabout way. Ellen White speaks about it. Adventists believe it.
Alors c'est dit d'une manière un peu circulaire. Les adventistes le croient et Mike en a parlé.
There is a curse
Il y a une malédiction
that's put over creation.
qui est donc placée sur la création.
And because Eve is the one that sinned first,
Et parce que Ève est celle qui a péché en premier,
she was punished.
elle a été punie.
And we all know what punishment was.
On sait tous c'est quoi cette punition.
It almost sounds
On dirait presque
prophetic.
que c'est prophétique.
But we have learned that it's not an inevitable statement. It's just an observation of what will happen when people separate themselves from God. And it gives it in a specific context in the relationship between between spouses. But it's not an inevitable punishment or curse that's placed upon her. That's the point we've all learned. Curtis.
You and Natasha have summed up what I wanted to say.
Alors je pense que toi et Natacha, vous avez bien résumé ce que vous voulez dire.
In that, if I say the emotions of love and hate
Donc si je parle des émotions de l'amour ou de la haine,
are descriptions of how humanity reacts to conditions.
ce sont la réaction de la manière dont l'humanité réagit à certaines conditions.
Today, thank you, we like things and we dislike things. Do you believe when you get to heaven that you're going to like everything? Did you? So Shemaine said in our naivety, yes. So you don't like a certain food here. Will your taste buds change or will you be forced to eat things you don't like? So you can see that there will be things you like and dislike about heaven. And like and dislike in Ecclesiastes, it's not, those words aren't used. What words are used? Love and hate. They're just facets of the same emotion. So when you love and hate, you don't have to manipulate the information, because then it can go to good and evil. So when we start thinking about heaven and earth, and we see how we can understand these emotional responses, we have to be careful how we attach morality to those concepts or those emotions. Because if we start thinking that hating is bad and loving is good, which is how most people think it, how can God instruct you to do bad things? God can't do that. And as Natasha said, if you get to the place where you understand that you're not instructed to hate, that means you cannot be instructed to love. And yet you'll tell me there's verse after verse that says we're supposed to love. A new commandment I give you. Love one another. And what's so wrong about all of that? That it was a lie. Because it's not a new commandment. It's just God, Jesus, trying to remind people that the great test is the golden rule. Iselin, you had a question? And we'll probably close with this because I think we're running over time.
So in my idea, when we will be in heaven, we will love everything because everything is perfect. So why we think about hate things that we will not love in heaven? So that means that I have a bad understanding about heaven.
If your question is, you have a... If your question is, do you have a wrong understanding of heaven? Yes.
Oui, mais t'as parlé en français là.
Ma question c'est
En anglais.
pourquoi donc comment est-ce qu'il sait qu'il y a des choses que vous n'aimez pas?
Because you have preferences. And if you don't get what you prefer in heaven, you dislike it. And dislike is a soft version of hate. The same emotion. And by the way, I don't know what people's concept of heaven is, but I've spent 2 days here and I haven't had any bad experiences. So I can't imagine heaven being better than this weekend and last weekend and the weekend before. I don't know what your experience has been just today here. If you had bad food, a fight with somebody, you're stressed, you may have some illness. Understand that we'll get new bodies. So all of that goes away. But to me, heaven isn't about bodies, it's about relationships. And I haven't had a bad one today. So I can't imagine heaven being any better than this. But most people do. And it's often because they have a bad relationship here. And all you need to do is know how to manage relationships. And then you can have what Ellen White says, heaven on earth. I don't know if that answers your question. Heaven won't be some perfect place that's fundamentally different to this place. Most human beings today are on autopilot. They're not controlled by demons. The demonic work was done centuries ago. And we're self-functioning. In closing, is the defense mechanism inbuilt in us or is it something we cultivate? It's definitely inbuilt. It's innate in our construction, our creation. Can you cultivate it, or what I would call weaponize it? For sure. We would probably call it in our context domestic abuse. It's not the only abuse, but I've just used it because we talk about that a lot. That is cultivated. But these defense mechanisms, which are equally attack mechanisms, by the way, sure they can be cultivated or weaponized. That's what makes our lives miserable here. And I'm supposed to finish now. Let's close this prayer. Dear Lord, I want to thank you for a taste of heaven, not just through these 2 presentations with people online, not only through this day with this family that I am with, but through all the personal interactions, all the protection that you have afforded me. If I didn't know better, this would be heaven. I thank you that despite the beauties of this weekend's experience, heaven will be different. There'll be no enemy. There'll be no physical signs of sin. And with people of equal minds who desire to serve one another, to live the golden rule, I and all of us look forward to heaven. In the meantime, continue to guide, protect, and shield us, and help us to be continual learners. Amen.